Welcome to Tales of Wild West. Dust clung to the town like a fever that would not break. The wind carried it through open doors, down the narrow street, into the cracks of weathered boards. By late afternoon the light turned amber, painting the place in the tired gold of a day too long. At the edge of it all stood the jail, a squat adobe shape with iron teeth in its windows. Inside, chained to a bolt in the wall, sat a young woman whose name most here spoke only in whispers. Her wrists bore the faint shadow of blood where the shackles had rubbed her raw. She sat with her knees drawn close, back straight against the wall, refusing the slump of defeat. The dress she wore had once been blue, now it was a faded shadow of sky, its hem ragged from hard travel. Dust streaked her cheek, but her eyes, clear, dark, steady, met anyone who dared to look in. She had been brought here the night before, dragged from her father's porch while neighbors looked on. The story had flown faster than a prairie fire. She had refused to marry Ezra Call, the cattle buyer whose fortune was built on debt and fear. The sheriff called it legal persuasion. Said her father owed more than he could ever repay, and Ezra was offering a solution. But everyone knew the truth, it was punishment for saying no. From the boardwalk outside voices drifted in, thick with curiosity. A pair of women paused at the window, peering in like it was a display. One clucked her tongue and said it was a pity, pretty girls should know when to bend. The other just smirked and said she'd heard the girl was headstrong, as though it were a sickness. She ignored them. She focused instead on the sliver of light crawling across the floor as the sun moved, measuring time by its slow crawl. Somewhere in her mind she heard her mother's voice, soft as worn cotton, telling her the open plains belonged to those who could outlast the wind. The deputy came near sundown, fumbling with the keys. His breath carried whiskey, his eyes carried boredom. Best think about saying yes, he muttered, not unkind but not kindly either. A woman alone don't last long out here. She didn't answer. His shrug said he was used to silence. The door closed again, the bolt sliding into place like the closing of a book no one would finish reading. In the saloon across the street, Ezra Call's laughter rolled out into the dust. Men gathered at his table, leaning in to hear the details of what he'd do once she was his wife. He told them she'd learn quick enough that pride had no place under his roof. Some laughed, some looked away, but no one stopped him. By the corner of the room, a man sat with his back to the wall, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in his hands. His hat brim shadowed most of his face, but his eyes lifted at the sound of the laughter. He had the look of a man who'd spent years outdoors, skin darkened by sun, hands built by work that did not forgive mistakes. He didn't join in the talk, didn't offer his opinion. Instead, he listened, and in the quiet curve of his jaw was the weight of something he didn't yet name. When he left the saloon, he walked a long way past the jail. He might have kept going if not for the sound, faint, nearly lost to the wind, of someone humming. He stopped without meaning to. The tune was an old lullaby, the kind mothers once sang in lamplight. He remembered it from years ago, in a house that no longer stood, from a voice now gone. He glanced toward the barred window. In the dim, he could just make out the shape of her, head bowed, chain at her ankle glinting when she shifted. She wasn't looking at him. Maybe she didn't know he was there. Still, something about her posture, the unbroken line of her back, made him linger. A wagon rattled past, breaking the moment. When the dust cleared, he was gone. Inside, the woman stopped humming, listening to the quiet that followed. She thought she'd heard footsteps pause outside her cell, then fade away. She told herself it meant nothing. Night fell without ceremony. The jail cooled, the walls breathing out the day's heat. She lay down on the hard bench, eyes open to the narrow slice of sky through the bars. Stars blinked there, far away, indifferent. Somewhere a coyote called. She thought about the land beyond this town, the smell of sage after rain, the feeling of wind that didn't carry voices telling her what she owed. Her father had once promised her she'd marry for love. But debts had a way of erasing promises. Ezra Call had arrived at their door with his contract and his smirk, and her father had looked away when she said no. She'd expected shouting, perhaps even a slap. She hadn't expected the sheriff and 2 deputies to take her by the arms and lead her into the street. She turned on her side, drawing her knees close against the cold. Tomorrow they'd come again. She didn't know what she would do, only that she would not say yes. Across town, the man from the saloon lay in a small rented room above the feed store. He could not sleep. The sound of that lullaby threaded through his thoughts like a trail through grass. He told himself it wasn't his business. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to know better than to take on more. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw the bruised dark rings around her wrists, the steadiness in her gaze. The morning would bring heat and dust again. It would bring voices and decisions made by other men. But tonight, in the thin quiet between midnight and dawn, he found himself wondering, not for the first time, how far a man might go to keep someone from breaking. And in the cell, with her eyes finally drifting closed, she did not know that someone had already begun to ask that question. Morning broke with the slow pale light of a sky not yet decided between day and night. The town stirred reluctantly, doors opening with the creak of dry wood, boots scuffing against boardwalks still cool from the darkness. Inside the small jail, she sat awake before the first shadow of dawn had reached the bars, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the square of earth outside the window. She could smell bread baking somewhere down the street, hear the faint tap of a hammer, and the deep, measured thump of a horse's hooves approaching. The rancher came into town without hurry, reins held loose, his mare's ears twitching at every sound. His face carried the wear of years spent in sun and wind, lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes. He rode with the ease of someone who belonged to no one and nothing but the land beneath his horse. At the hitching post outside the mercantile, he dismounted, the quiet weight of him drawing a glance or two from townsfolk who knew he seldom came in unless need pressed him. As he crossed toward the general store, his gaze slid toward the jail. He did not stop, not yet, but the image caught in his periphery, the figure behind the iron, the chain resting against her ankle like a cruel ornament, lodged itself somewhere between thought and memory. Inside the store, he took flour, coffee, a coil of rope. The shopkeeper's wife leaned in from behind the counter, voice lowered to the conspiratorial hum of gossip. "You hear about the call girl?" she said, though she knew well he had. "Won't do as she's told. Foolish thing. Ezra says he'll have her right by the week's end." He gave no reply beyond the faintest incline of his head, the kind that could be mistaken for disinterest. Yet when he stepped back into the street, his eyes went first to the jailhouse again, drawn as though some thread had been tied without his consent. She noticed him this time, just a shadowed figure on the other side of the glass, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. She did not look away, and neither did he, until the sound of boots on the boardwalk broke whatever passed between them. From the saloon came the familiar voice of Ezra Call, loud and bright with drink even at this hour. He stood in the doorway, retelling for anyone who'd listen how he'd soon make a wife out of a girl too proud for her own good. The words hung in the air like flies over a carcass. A few laughed, though most shifted their weight, uneasy. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He had learned long ago that a man could spend himself into the ground speaking against cruelty in a place where cruelty wore fine boots. Still, the sound followed him, clinging to the edges of his thoughts as he loaded his supplies into the saddlebag. At midday, he found himself in the saloon for a cup of coffee, though he told himself it was only for the coffee. Ezra was there, cards in hand, boasting about the stock he'd bought, the deals he'd struck, and how some women just needed teaching. His friends laughed louder this time. The rancher's gaze flicked toward the far wall, where dust motes spun in a thin blade of sunlight. He did not join in. Instead, he let his thoughts drift to the sound of a lullaby he'd heard once in the street, sung by a voice soft yet unbroken. By late afternoon, the heat pressed down like a hand. Outside, children chased each other through the dust, their shouts bouncing off the walls of the narrow street. The rancher walked past the jail again on his way to the livery. This time, he slowed, one hand resting lightly on the fence post. Inside, she sat on the bench, hands folded loosely in her lap, head tilted toward the light. There was a stillness about her that was not submission but a refusal to be moved by anything she did not choose. He stepped closer to the bars, enough that she could see his eyes. "Why are you here?" The words left him before he had decided to speak them. She studied him a moment, then said, "Because I said no." The simplicity of it cut through the air, sharper than any explanation. His eyes moved to the iron cuff at her ankle, then back to her face. "They'll make it yes," he said quietly. Her lips curved, not in a smile but in something closer to pity. "They can make the papers say it. They can't make it true." For a moment, the street sounds faded, leaving only the creak of the jail's frame in the sun. He nodded once, as if committing her words to memory, then stepped back. That night, the town held its usual rhythm, lamplight spilling from windows, the smell of cooked meat and spilled beer. The rancher took a room above the feed store, the same room he always used when staying over. But sleep stayed far. Through the open window, he heard the shuffle of boots on the boardwalk, the slam of the saloon's door, laughter that soured in the dark. He thought of the chain again, how it gleamed in the light like a thing made to be noticed. He thought of the look in her eyes, steady, as though she were holding the line against something no one else could see. He told himself it was not his business. But the lie tasted thin. Across town, she lay awake on the bench, watching moonlight gather on the floor. Tomorrow they'd march her into the street, read the order, and bind her to the man she would not choose. She did not know if she feared the day more for what it might bring or for what it might take away. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped and a saddle shifted under weight. She thought she heard it stop near the jail, the faint scuff of boots on packed earth. For a heartbeat, she imagined the door swinging open, the chain falling from her ankle. But no key turned in the lock. The sound moved on, fading into the night. Still, the thought remained, stubborn as the stars above her, that someone out there had paused at her cell and had not yet decided to keep walking. The morning rose without mercy, the sky a pale, hard blue that promised heat before noon. Word spread quick as wildfire. Today was the binding. Folks stepped from doorways, their faces wearing the uneasy mix of curiosity and shame, like watchers at a hanging who would later insist they hadn't wanted to see. The jail door opened with a groan. The sheriff stood there, a paper folded in his hand, his badge catching the light. Behind him, the deputy carried the key and the length of chain that had held her since she'd been brought in. She stepped into the daylight without flinching, her wrists bare now but her ankle still cuffed, the chain rattling against the packed dirt. She wore the same faded blue dress, brushed clean as best she could manage. Her hair was tied back, not for beauty but for dignity. Ezra Call waited in the street, boots polished, a broad-brimmed hat shadowing the smirk he wore like armor. A crowd ringed the space, leaving just enough room between him and the jail for her to walk. The sheriff began to read, his voice dry, the words heavy with the shape of a deal struck in back rooms. The rancher stood at the edge of the crowd, hands loose at his sides. He had not planned to be here, not in the front at least, but the sound of the sheriff's voice cut through him like a blade through thin cloth. He watched her lift her chin, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond this day. The paper ended with the phrase, "Until death parts them," and the murmur that followed carried the smell of something spoiled. Ezra stepped forward, hand outstretched as though expecting her to take it. She did not move. The sheriff's eyes flicked between them, the crowd tightening in its quiet. And then the rancher's voice came, steady, cutting across the heat. "I'll pay the debt." Heads turned. The sheriff frowned. "Not your concern, Ward." "It is now," the rancher said, stepping forward. "Full amount. In cash. She leaves town with me. Free." Ezra laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You can't just—" "I can't," the rancher interrupted, his tone even. "It clears the ledger. No man here can claim her by debt after that." The sheriff hesitated. The offer was lawful, and everyone knew it. To refuse would make the whole proceeding look like what it truly was. Ezra's jaw worked, the smirk gone, replaced by something colder. "She'll just be trading one set of chains for another," Ezra said, voice pitched to Carrie. The rancher's gaze didn't waver. "Only difference is mine won't be there." For a moment, The street was silent save for the restless shift of horses. The sheriff took the pouch of coins when it was offered, weighing it in his hand before nodding once. "Debt's cleared." The deputy moved forward, fumbling with the lock at her ankle. The shackle fell with a dull clang onto the dirt, and she drew in a slow breath, her first without iron in days. She did not look at the rancher, but her eyes softened almost imperceptibly, as though something in her chest had eased. Ezra stepped back, his boots grinding the dirt, but his eyes promised this was not finished. He turned sharply, the crowd parting for him, whispers curling in his wake. The rancher didn't touch her. He only stepped aside, leaving her the space to choose her path. She glanced once toward the road out of town, then began walking, her steps measured, the dust rising around her ankles. He fell into pace beside her without a word. They passed the last building, the noise of the town falling behind. The road ahead stretched westward, the horizon wavering in the heat. She felt the eyes still on her back, but each step put them further away. After a while she said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "But I couldn't stand there and watch." She studied him from the corner of her eye. "You don't know me." "I know enough." They rode in silence for some miles after that. A hawk circled overhead. The sun climbed higher, the air shimmering where the road bent toward the hills. She shifted in the saddle he brought for her, and used to the weight of freedom and the strangeness of not knowing where she was headed. At a small creek, they stopped to water the horses. She crouched by the bank, letting the cold flow over her hands. The rancher filled his canteen, glancing upstream where the water disappeared into cottonwoods. "What now?" she asked. "You rest," he said simply. "We'll ride until the light goes, then camp. After that," he shrugged. "After that, it's yours to decide." His words landed heavier than she expected. She was not used to choices, not ones that mattered. The idea of deciding where her feet would go next felt both intoxicating and dangerous. They mounted again, the land opening before them. But behind, far off, dust rose where another set of riders followed at a distance. Neither of them spoke of it, though both had seen. By late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows over the road. The rancher glanced back once more, his jaw tightening. "We'll push a little further," he said. She didn't ask why. She already knew. And somewhere inside, beneath the layers of fear and weariness, a new thought took root, that the man beside her had not freed her to keep her, but to guard the space where she might begin again. The dust behind them did not fade. They crossed the low hills in the cool hush before dawn, the horizon a soft bruise of violet and rose. The night's thin frost still clung to the grass, breaking into silver drops beneath the horses' steps. She kept her gaze forward, her hands resting light on the reins. Behind them, the road wound back toward the town, and though no riders were in sight, the memory of dust trailing them yesterday lingered in her thoughts. They rode without hurry. He let the silence stretch, not pressing her with questions. She was grateful for it. After days in a cell, every sound of the open land felt almost too wide, water running unseen through gullies, the distant crack of a branch as deer moved through brush, the low call of a mourning dove somewhere ahead. By mid-morning they reached a bend in the river where the banks rose high on either side. Cottonwoods leaned toward the water, their leaves whispering. He led the horses down to drink, then handed her the small tin cup from his saddlebag. She knelt to fill it, watching the sunlight break into ribbons on the current. "You'll want to pace yourself," he said. "First days out can fool you. Feels easy till it doesn't." She nodded. "I've walked farther than I've ridden. You'll get used to it." His tone was quiet, not commanding, more like the way a man might talk to a skittish colt, steady and without hurry. They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, then followed the river west. Once, when her mare stumbled on a loose stone, his hand shot out, steadying the reins without touching her. She noticed he always gave her just enough space to decide her own pace. By noon the land opened into a stretch of tall grass, the wind moving through it in long, slow waves. They dismounted in the shade of a lone mesquite tree, eating what he called trail rations, salted beef, bread that was more hard than soft. She chewed in silence, watching a hawk circle high above. He unrolled his coat and laid it on the ground for her to sit, keeping to the other side of the tree. It wasn't distance born of disinterest. It was a kind of respect she had rarely known. "You got people west?" he asked after a while. She shook her head. "No one waiting. That can be its own kind of freedom." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was worn, the kind of worn that came from years of weather and labor, but his eyes held no hunger to possess, no gleam of advantage. "And you?" she asked. He gave a small shrug. "Had family? Long gone now." He tapped the brim of his hat lower, ending the subject without sharpness. In the afternoon the sky shifted. Clouds gathered in slow ranks, the wind gaining weight. He glanced upward. "We'll need cover." They found it in a rock overhang near the river's bend. The space was narrow but dry. While he gathered wood for a small fire, she unrolled the blanket from his pack, shaking the dust from it. The air smelled of wet earth as the first rain began to fall beyond the lip of the shelter. They sat close enough to share the fire's heat, listening to the rain's uneven drumming. After a time, she spoke, her voice low. "When they locked me in that room, I thought maybe I could get used to it. Just to keep from being hurt worse. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sky. I couldn't make myself forget it." His gaze stayed on the fire. "That's how you know you're not beaten." She turned his words over in her mind, feeling their weight. For the first time since leaving the town, she felt the faint pull of something not quite trust but close enough to brush against it. When the rain eased, they stepped outside. The land smelled sharper, greener. The clouds tore open in the west, spilling gold light onto the wet grass. She caught herself smiling, just a little. They rode on until the shadows stretched long, stopping near a stand of cottonwoods. He showed her how to tether the horses for the night, how to set the bedroll so the ground's cold wouldn't seep through. She listened, learning the quiet rhythm of his voice. After they'd eaten, she mended a tear in his coat, the needle moving steady in her hands. He watched her work without comment, his eyes soft in the firelight. When she handed it back, he only nodded once, but something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't need the shape of words. The night was clear, the stars burning sharp above. She lay on her side, listening to the river's whisper beyond the trees. Sleep came slower than she wished, her thoughts snagging on the faint crunch of hoofbeats carried by the wind. They were distant, but not so distant she could pretend they were her imagination. She opened her eyes, finding him already awake, sitting against his saddle with his rifle laid across his knees. His gaze was turned toward the darkness beyond the cottonwoods, where the sound had come from. "Go back to sleep," he said quietly. But she didn't. They broke camp before the first red edge of dawn touched the horizon. The river lay behind them now, the air sharp with the smell of wet grass and cooling embers. Neither spoke much, but there was an unspoken agreement in the way they moved, quick, efficient, as if both knew the road ahead would not be empty. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared to a bright, pitiless blue. They rode in single file along a narrow trail between ridges, the sound of hooves muted by sand and stone. She kept glancing back, her eyes narrowing at each rise of dust on the horizon. It was there again, fainter now, but still following. At a narrow pass where the trail dropped into a shallow ford, he slowed his horse, scanning the ridgelines. "We'll cross here," he said, voice low. The water was no more than knee-deep, but its current was quick, the surface flashing with shards of sunlight. He guided his horse across first, waiting on the far bank. She followed, gripping the reins tighter than she meant to, feeling the cold swirl around her boots. When they were halfway up the opposite bank, the sound came, hooves pounding hard, voices sharp and closing. She turned in the saddle to see Ezra call and two men cresting the ridge behind them, their horses lunging down toward the ford. Ezra's voice carried over the water. "You think you can just take what's mine?" The rancher swung his horse around, placing himself between her and the riders. "She's not yours," he said, his tone even but carrying like a bell. Ezra's grin was thin, humorless. Debt or no debt, she gave her word. She gave nothing. The two hired men fanned out, one moving toward the shallows, the other climbing the bank to flank them. She felt the air tighten, the moment stretching thin. He sat his horse steady, no weapon in hand, only his presence like a wall. "You move, Ward," one of the men said, "or you'll have trouble you can't ride away from." Before the rancher could answer, she pushed her mare forward, the sudden motion drawing every eye. She stopped between him and the men, her voice cutting through the churn of the river. "I am not property," she said. "Not his, not anyone's. I won't go back." Ezra's face shifted, first surprise, then something darker. "You think he can keep you safe out here? There's 100 ways this land will break you." She met his gaze, steady as stone. "Better the land than you." The hired men hesitated. One looked at Ezra, the question unspoken. The other's horse sidestepped in the water, uneasy. The river seemed louder now, rushing past them all. The rancher's voice came quiet, but with a weight that left no room for doubt. "Turn back." For a long breath, no one moved. Then the man on the bank eased his reins, backing his horse a step. The other followed. Ezra stayed where he was, his eyes locked on her like a promise he meant to collect someday. But the moment had slipped from him. With a sharp pull on the reins, he wheeled his horse and rode back the way he'd come, the others falling in behind. She didn't breathe until their dust was swallowed by distance. He didn't speak, only gestured for her to ride on. They climbed the next rise in silence, the land opening wide before them. By late afternoon, the hills broke into a long valley. At its center, a cluster of cottonwoods marked the winding thread of another river. Beyond it, the ranch spread out, a scatter of low buildings, fences running like stitches over the land, cattle grazing in the distance. She slowed, taking it in. It wasn't grand in the way Ezra's holdings had been. It felt quieter, older, as if it had grown from the earth itself rather than been built to claim it. "This is yours?" she asked. "It's where I live," he said. "Yours too if you want it." The word settled in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She had no answer yet, only the knowledge that for the first time, the choice was hers. They rode down into the valley. The horses quickened, sensing home. When they reached the yard, he swung down first, offering a hand she didn't take until she was sure it was offered for balance, and not possession. Inside the small house, the air was cool, smelling faintly of cedar. There were 2 chairs by the hearth, a table worn smooth at the edges, shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee. It felt lived in, but not crowded. He left her there to tend the horses. She stood in the doorway, watching the sun sink behind the hills, its light spilling gold across the grass. For a moment she let herself believe the worst was behind her. Then, faint on the wind, she heard it, the distant rhythm of hooves, too steady to be cattle. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Somewhere out there, the dust was rising again,